She fled across the desert with nothing but a silver thimble and desperate hope. He was an ex-gunslinger, seeking solitude on his remote ranch. When 3 armed men from her past arrive in town, their lives change forever. Will they survive the thaw? Coming storm. If you're ready for a tale of redemption, courage, and unexpected love in the unforgiving American West, hit that like button and subscribe now. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community across the globe. Your next obsession begins now. The desert held secrets. Clara Mendoza knew this when she stumbled into Aguamiel, her boots worn thin and her spirit thinner still. The sun hung like a copper penny in the faded denim sky as she watched the town materialize from the shimmering heat, a mirage made manifest through her desperation. 5 weathered buildings anchored by a saloon, a general store with peeling paint and silence, so much silence after weeks of looking over her shoulder. She clutched the small cloth pouch hanging from her neck, fingers tracing the outline of her mother's silver thimble inside, the only possession she couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything else from her former life remained in El Paso, abandoned in her hasty departure. That life belonged to Marisol Vega now, a ghost who whispered warnings in her dreams. Clara's tongue felt swollen with thirst, her lips cracked like the parched earth beneath her feet. A worn wooden sign creaked on rusty hinges. Aguamiel, population 42-6. She allowed herself a bitter smile. 43 now, though she didn't plan to stay long enough for anyone to bother changing the sign. The general store's bell announced her arrival with cheerful indifference. Inside, a grey-haired woman looked up from behind the counter, her face a map of sun-etched lines. Water, Clara managed, her voice raspy. The woman filled a tin cup from a barrel and slid it across the counter without a word. Clara drank deeply, feeling the cool liquid trace a path down her dusty throat. "Passing through?" the woman asked finally, her eyes taking measure. Clara lowered the cup. "Looking for work." "Not much work to be found here," the woman replied, her gaze lingering on Clara's city-bred hands and the quality of her travel-worn clothes. "Unless you're willing to get those hands dirty." "I am." The words came out firmer than Clara had intended, as if to convince herself as much as the shopkeeper. The older woman nodded toward the window. "Burke's Ranch, 5 miles east. Heard he needs help since his housekeeper took ill. Man lives alone, keeps to himself." She hesitated. "Has a reputation." Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest. What kind of reputation? The kind that makes people leave him be. The woman's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You got a name?" "Clara." The syllables felt foreign on her tongue after weeks of silence. "Edith Holloway." The woman wiped her hands on her apron. "That'll be 2 cents for the water." Clara carefully counted out the coins from her dwindling supply, aware of Edith's eyes on her trembling fingers. "East, you said?" Clara asked, turning toward the door. "Sun'll be down soon," Edith observed. 40 cents gets you a room upstairs for the night." Clara's hand tightened around her small purse. "I should get started." Edith shrugged, but her eyes held something, concern perhaps, or suspicion. "Suit yourself." Outside, Clara squinted against the dying light. 5 miles east, the weight of her single bag seemed to increase with each step as she left the small cluster of buildings behind. The desert stretched before her, painted in deepening shades of amber and violet. In the distance, a solitary mesa rose like a sentinel, its silhouette sharp against the darkening sky. The wind whispered across the chaparral, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and kept walking, each step carrying her further from what she had been and closer to what she must become. The thimble pressed against her collarbone, a small hard reminder of everything she had lost. Night fell around her like a veil, stars emerging one by one until the sky pulsed with distant light. When the ranch house finally appeared, it stood as a dark shape against the horizon, neither welcoming nor forbidding, merely waiting. Samuel Burke sensed the stranger before he saw her. 20 years since he'd worn a gun, but old instincts died reluctantly. He lowered the book in his lap, head tilting toward the soft disturbance of gravel beneath tentative feet. The knock, when it came, was almost apologetic. He moved without haste to the door, oil lamp in hand. Its glow illuminated a woman, slender, dust-covered, with eyes that reminded him of a cornered deer. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing high cheekbones and a mouth set in determination. "Mr. Burke." Her voice carried the faintest trace of an accent. "No one comes to my door after dark with good news," he said, his voice rough from disuse. She straightened her shoulders. "Mrs. Holloway from town said you might need help with housekeeping." Samuel studied her, city clothes beneath the desert grime, educated speech despite her evident fatigue. A woman running from something, he recognized the signs all too well. "Mrs. Holloway should mind her business," he said, but stepped aside. "Come in before you fall down." The woman hesitated at the threshold, eyes darting past him to survey the room. "Calculating exits," he noted. Another bad sign. "I don't know." "Your name," he said. "Clara." No surname offered. Another piece of the puzzle. His home was sparse but orderly. A table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace, bookshelves lining one wall. Clara's gaze lingered on the books, surprise flickering across her features. "Sit," he instructed, gesturing to the table as he moved to the kitchen. He returned with bread, cheese, and water, setting them before her without ceremony. "Eat." She did, with the careful restraint of someone accustomed to hunger, but not to showing it. Samuel returned to his chair by the fire, picking up his book, Thoreau's Walden, but his attention remained on the stranger at his table. "I can cook," she said after finishing her modest meal. "Clean, mend. I don't need much payment, just a place to stay for a while." "For a while," he repeated. "Until what?" Her eyes met his, steady now. "Until I move on." Samuel closed his book. "I had a housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy. Woman talked enough for 10 people, but she kept things in order. She's been sick 3 weeks. Now, I won't talk," Clara said quickly. I gathered your meaning." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "There's a small room off the kitchen. It's yours if you want it. We'll discuss terms in the morning." Relief softened her features momentarily before the guardedness returned. "Thank you, Mr. Burke." "Samuel," he corrected. "We're a long way from formality out here." She nodded, but didn't offer reciprocal familiarity. Samuel showed her to the small room with its narrow bed and single window. She clutched her bag to her chest as if it contained her entire world. "Locks on the inside," he said, tapping the door. "No one will bother you here." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Understanding passed between them, a current of recognition. They were 2 people accustomed to watching shadows. "Good night, Mr. Burke," she said softly. "Samuel," he corrected again and left her to her solitude. Later, from his room, he heard the soft click of the lock, followed by silence. Samuel stared at the ceiling, listening to the settling of the house around him. It had been a long time since another person had disturbed the quiet of his carefully constructed exile. Outside, the desert wind carried the distant howl of coyotes. Samuel closed his eyes, but sleep remained elusive. The woman, Clara, had brought something with her beyond her meager possessions, an uneasiness that settled into the corners of his home like dust after a storm. His hand moved instinctively to the drawer beside his bed, fingers brushing the cold metal within. 20 years since he'd worn a gun, but he'd never been foolish enough to be without one. Dawn arrived with the same reliability that had anchored Samuel's days for 18 years. He rose with the first pale fingers of light stretching across the horizon, muscles protesting as they always did, the persistent echoes of old injuries and older memories. He dressed methodically, each movement precise, a ritual unchanged by the presence of the stranger beneath his roof. Only when he stepped into the main room did the difference announce itself, the scent of coffee, stronger and richer than his usual brew. Clara stood at the stove, her back to him. She had found an apron, Mrs. Abernathy's, he supposed, and cinched it tight around her narrow waist. Her hair was neatly braided, revealing the vulnerable curve of her neck. "You're up." "Early," he observed. She turned, composed despite his silent approach. "Habit," she replied, offering nothing more as she poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it on the table. Samuel accepted the offering with a nod, and took his seat. The first sip confirmed his suspicion. She knew her way around a kitchen, better than someone merely seeking menial work. "This is good," he acknowledged. Something almost like pride flickered across her face before disappearing behind her careful mask. "Thank you." She served a simple breakfast of eggs and cornbread, standing with her hands folded until he gestured for her to join him. They ate in silence, the scrape of utensils against plates the only conversation. "I'll show you the property after breakfast," Samuel said finally. "It's not much, but you should know your way around." Clara nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly. "What are your expectations? For my work, I mean. Keep the house in order. Prepare meals, laundry once a week." He paused. "I don't entertain guests. I don't discuss business at the table. I value my privacy." "That suits me," she said quietly. "I'm sure it does." The words came out drier than he'd intended, and he saw her shoulders tense. "You'll have Sundays to yourself. I'll pay you $8 a month plus room and board." Her eyes widened slightly. The wage was generous for housekeeping, especially with lodging included. She started to speak, then seemed to think better of it, settling instead for a simple "thank you." After breakfast, Samuel led her around the modest ranch house, 4 rooms plus her small chamber off the kitchen, a covered porch wrapping around 3 sides, a well-tended garden plot. Beyond stood a barn corral and a small stable housing 3 horses. "You manage all this alone?" Clara asked as they walked. "I have help with the heavier work. Miguel comes 3 times a week for the livestock and repairs." Samuel glanced at her. "He brings his wife sometimes, Maria. You might find her company agreeable." Clara's expression remained carefully neutral. "I don't want to impose on anyone." Samuel stopped walking, turning to face her fully. The morning sun illuminated the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. "People in Aguamiel mind their business," he said deliberately, "but they notice strangers. Being seen with Miguel and Maria occasionally would be wise. Less questions." Understanding dawned in her eyes. He was offering more than employment. He was offering cover, legitimacy. She swallowed, her hand rising unconsciously to touch something beneath her blouse. "I'll remember that," she said. Samuel nodded once and resumed walking. At the edge of the property, he pointed toward the distant mesa that dominated the eastern view. "That's Shadow Mesa," he explained. "Good landmark if you ever lose your way. You can see it from anywhere within 10 miles. Clara studied the formation, its distinctive silhouette etched against the sky. "It looks like a sleeping giant." Samuel raised an eyebrow, surprised by the observation. "Local Apache legend says it's their ancestor, turned to stone while standing. God, been watching over this valley for centuries." A comfortable silence settled between them as they gazed at the mesa. For a moment, they were simply 2 people sharing a view, the weight of their respective secrets temporarily lifted. "What do you grow?" Clara asked eventually, nodding toward the garden. "Whatever survives," Samuel replied. "Beans, corn, tomatoes in summer. Few herbs Mrs. Abernathy insisted on." His expression softened slightly. She believed in the healing properties of plants. Said my soul needed tending more than my stomach. Clara's lips curved in the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "She sounds wise." "Stubborn," Samuel corrected, but there was affection in his voice. "Garden's yours now if you've a mind for it." The responsibility seemed to please her. As they walked back toward the house, Samuel noticed how her eyes lingered on the garden plot, already planning, perhaps seeing possibility where he had only seen necessity. "Mr. Burke, Samuel," she amended, catching herself. "Thank you for this opportunity." He recognized the weight behind her simple words, the deeper gratitude for questions unasked and judgments withheld. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Clara," he said quietly, "even if they don't believe it themselves." Her eyes met his, startled by his perception, or perhaps by the unexpected kindness. For a moment, her carefully constructed walls wavered. Then she nodded, composing herself once more. "I'll start with the west rooms," she said, retreating to the safety of work and routine. Samuel watched her walk back to the house, her steps more purposeful than they had been the night before. Whatever Clara was running from, she had found temporary sanctuary. How long that sanctuary would last remained to be seen. Days unfolded with unexpected ease as Clara and Samuel established the delicate choreography of two solitary people sharing space. She learned his habits without being told. The coffee ready when he rose before dawn, meals served precisely at noon and 6, the lamp in his study filled and trimmed each evening. In turn, Samuel adjusted to her presence like a man growing accustomed to a change in weather. He began leaving his boots outside the door after noting how meticulously she cleaned the floors. He returned from town one day with a small sack of Mexican chocolate after observing her longing glance at the dregs of his supply. They existed primarily in companionable silence, broken only by necessary communication and the occasional observation about the changing season or the behavior of the horses. Clara found unexpected comfort in this quiet. In El Paso, silence had been a luxury never afforded in the crowded rooms she had shared with 3 other working women. Here, silence stretched like the desert itself, vast, undemanding, healing in its emptiness. On her 4th Sunday at the ranch, Clara ventured to the garden with the first light of dawn. The air held the promise of warmth, though the nights remained cool. She knelt in the soft earth, hands working methodically to clear weeds from around the tender shoots of early vegetables. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where her thoughts could wander freely as her hands remained occupied. She added rows of herbs, not just the practical ones Samuel used for cooking, but others she remembered from her grandmother's garden in Sonora. Epazote, yerba buena, ruda. Each seed planted felt like a small act of faith, a belief in a future extending beyond tomorrow. Samuel found her there late one afternoon, the setting sun painting her profile in amber light as she worked. He approached without speaking, observing her careful attention to each plant. "You've brought it back to life," he said finally. Clara looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist. It just needed attention. Samuel's gaze swept over the neat rows, the carefully placed stones marking different sections, the small innovations she had introduced, a trellis fashioned from spare wood for climbing beans, a border of marigolds to deter pests. "Mrs. Abernathy would approve," he said, the highest compliment he could offer. Clara smiled, her usual reserve softened by genuine pleasure. "I visited her yesterday in town. She gave me some of her seedlings." She hesitated. "She asked about you." Samuel's expression remained neutral. "And what did you tell her?" "That you're well. That you still read too much and talk too little." The words slipped out before Clara could censure them, and she looked away, embarrassed by her presumption. To her surprise, Samuel chuckled, a rusty sound, as if seldom used. Accurate assessment. He crouched beside her, examining a cluster of small plants she had segregated from the others. His hands, Clara noticed, moved with surprising gentleness as he touched a delicate leaf. "Medicinal?" he asked. Clara nodded. "For headaches and stomach ailments, my grandmother taught me. Your grandmother was a curandera." His pronunciation of the Spanish word was unexpectedly accurate. "How did you know that word?" she asked, curiosity overcoming her usual caution. Samuel's eyes remained on the plants. "I spent time in Mexico years ago." The simple statement contained volumes. Clara heard it in his tone, saw it in the distant look that briefly claimed his features. Another piece of the puzzle that was Samuel Burke. "Yes," she admitted after a moment. "She was a healer. Not officially, but people came to her with their problems. And she taught you some things before she died." Clara brushed soil from her hands. "I was young." Samuel nodded, accepting her partial truth without pressing. He rose, offering his hand to help her up. Clara hesitated before taking it, feeling the strength in his calloused fingers, the careful way he withdrew once she was standing. "Miguel brought venison," he said, "if you're not opposed to cooking it." "I'm not," she replied, gathering her gardening tools. They walked back to the house side by side, close but not touching. The space between them seemed different somehow, not the careful distance of strangers, but the comfortable proximity of people growing accustomed to each other's Rhythms. That evening, as they shared the venison stew Clara had prepared, Samuel broke their customary dining silence. "I received a letter from Mrs. Abernathy," he said. "She's decided to move to Tucson to live with her daughter." Clara set down her spoon. "I'm sorry to hear that." Samuel studied her. "Are you?" "Yes." She met his gaze steadily. She spoke fondly. "Of you. Of this place." "Her position here is yours," Samuel said. "Permanently if you want it." The offer hung between them. Permanent. The word carried weight Clara hadn't allowed herself to consider. "You don't know anything about me," she said quietly. "I know enough." Samuel's voice was even. "You work hard. You respect boundaries. You don't ask questions you don't want asked of yourself." He paused. "The rest is your business." Clara felt something inside her chest loosen, a knot of tension she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten its presence. "Thank you," she said simply. Samuel nodded once and returned to his meal. The silence resumed, but it had shifted, become something new, a language of its own that spoke of trust, cautiously extended and gratefully received. Later, as Clara washed the dishes, she caught her reflection in the window glass. Her face looked different somehow, less haunted, more present. The woman who had stumbled into Aguamiel 5 weeks ago was beginning to fade, replaced by someone who dared to think beyond survival. Outside, the desert night enfolded the small ranch house. Clara dried her hands and moved to extinguish the kitchen lamp. Through the window she could see Samuel on the porch, his silhouette outlined against the starlit sky. Watching. Always watching. She wondered if he ever truly relaxed his vigilance. It occurred to her then that perhaps they were more alike than different. Two people standing guard against pasts that might at any moment intrude upon their carefully constructed present. Summer arrived with relentless intensity. The June sun, transforming the landscape into a shimmering mirage by midday. Clara adapted her routine, rising earlier to complete the heaviest work before heat made it unbearable. The garden required constant attention, precious water carried bucket by bucket. During the driest days, on one such morning, Clara knelt among the struggling plants, her broad-brimmed hat offering minimal protection as she carefully distributed water at the base of each stem. Sweat trickled between her shoulder blades, darkening the back of her simple cotton dress. "You'll make yourself ill," Samuel's voice came from behind her. Clara straightened, pressing one hand against her lower back. "The tomatoes won't survive another day without water." Samuel stood at the edge of the garden, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. "Plants can be replanted. People are less easily mended." The concern in his voice, masked by practicality, touched something in Clara. Over the past 2 months, these small moments of care had accumulated like raindrops in a barrel, individually insignificant, collectively substantial. "I'm nearly finished," she compromised. Samuel nodded, then hesitated. "I'm riding to the north pasture. Would be easier to show you the property boundary than to explain it." The invitation surprised her. Samuel rarely included her in his daily work, maintaining the careful separation between employer and employee. "Now?" she asked. "If you're willing to leave your vegetables to their fate for a few hours." The dry humor that occasionally surfaced in his speech never failed to catch her off guard. Clara smiled despite herself. "Let me change," she said. 20 minutes later, they rode side by side from the ranch house, Clara on a gentle sorrel mare named Penny, Samuel on his preferred buckskin gelding. The desert stretched before them, its apparent emptiness belied by the subtle vibrance Clara had learned to recognize. The pale green of creosote bushes, the unexpected burst of wildflowers after the brief spring rains, the darting movements of lizards and rabbits in the underbrush. Samuel rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. Clara, less experienced but determined, maintained a steady pace beside him. They crested a small rise, and Samuel reined his horse to a stop, gesturing toward the panoramic view. Berkland extends from Shadow Mesa in the east to that line of cottonwoods marking the creek in the west, he explained. Not the richest soil, but the water rights make it valuable enough. Clara's eyes traced the boundaries he indicated, understanding better now the scope of his solitary domain. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Samuel glanced at her, seeming to assess her sincerity. "Most people see only emptiness. Most people don't look closely enough," Clara replied. A hint of approval softened his weathered features. They continued riding, Samuel occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing practical information about the property. Clara listened attentively, storing away each detail as if she might be tested on it later. Near a small arroyo, they dismounted to rest the horses. Clara stretched her legs, feeling muscles unaccustomed to riding protest the morning's activity. Samuel produced a canteen and offered it to her first. "Thank you," she said, taking a careful drink before returning it. Samuel drank, then gestured toward a cluster of rocks providing meager shade. They settled there, a respectful distance between them, watching the horses graze on the sparse vegetation. "You ride well," Samuel observed. "Not your first time." Clara considered how much to reveal. "My father had horses before." Samuel nodded, accepting the fragment without pressing for the complete story. After a moment, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, holding it in his palm. "Found this yesterday," he said. "Thought you might like it." Clara leaned closer. In his hand lay a small stone, perfectly round and smooth, its surface marbled with stripes of deep red and amber. "It's beautiful," she said, genuinely touched by the unexpected gesture. "Desert agate," Samuel explained. "Apache believe they hold the heat of the sun, protect against harm." Clara accepted the stone, its surface warm against her palm. The simple gift carried a weight beyond its physical presence, acknowledgement of her place in his world, however temporary she still believed it to be. "I have something of my own," she found herself saying. Her fingers went to the cloth pouch at her neck, a gesture Samuel had observed but never questioned. She hesitated, then carefully withdrew the silver thimble, holding it in her palm. "My mother's? The only thing I brought with me." Samuel studied the small object, understanding its significance without explanation. "Family is what we carry with us," he said quietly. The simple statement unlocked something in Clara. "She taught me to sew when I was 6, she said, the words emerging unbidden. "Said a woman with a needle never goes hungry." Samuel's eyes met hers, recognition passing between them, the shared experience of loss, of carrying ghosts. "Was she right?" he asked. Clara closed her fingers around the thimble. "Yes, after my father died, her sewing kept us fed." She hesitated. "Until she couldn't sew anymore." Samuel nodded, accepting her offering of truth without demanding more. "My father worked other men's cattle his whole life," he said after a key moment. "Died with nothing but calluses to show for it. Promised myself I'd own the land beneath my feet one day." "And you do," Clara observed. "At a cost," Samuel replied, his gaze shifting to the distant horizon. The confession hung between them, neither elaborating further. They sat in companionable silence until Samuel finally stood, brushing dust from his clothing. "We should head back," he said, offering his hand. Clara took it, allowing him to help her to her feet. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The desert had drawn out their secrets, not fully but enough, small truths exchanged like rare gifts. As they rode back toward the ranch, Clara felt a curious lightness. The stone Samuel had given her rested in her pocket, a tangible reminder of belonging, however temporary. She watched his straight back as he rode slightly ahead, this man of few words who spoke most clearly through gestures. Coffee kept warm, a garden entrusted to her care, a protective stone offered without ceremony. For the first time since fleeing El Paso, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future extending beyond the next sunrise. The thought was both comforting and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a precipice and contemplating the step that would change everything. Aguamiel on market day pulsed with relative activity. Farmers from outlying ranches bringing produce, the monthly supply wagon from El Paso unloading goods at Holloway's general store, children released from their chores to play in the dusty street. Clara navigated through the modest bustle, her basket over one arm, mentally reviewing Samuel's list of supplies. 3 months at Burke Ranch had softened her wariness enough that these monthly trips to town no longer filled her with dread. Still, she maintained her guard, eyes habitually scanning faces, body tensed for quick movement if necessary. "Miss Clara," Edith Holloway's greeting carried across the store as Clara entered. "Right on time. Got those seeds you asked about last month?" Clara smiled, genuinely pleased. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. Mr. Burke's list is shorter than usual today." Edith began gathering items as Clara dictated them. "How is he?" the older woman asked, her tone carefully casual. "Well enough," Clara replied, matching Edith's affected nonchalance. Their dance of polite inquiry and measured response had become routine. Clara understood now what Samuel had meant about Aguamiel residents minding their business. They observed everything, but asked little directly, gathering information through implication and inference rather than interrogation. "Heard Miguel's wife made him take to bed with that cough," Edith continued, wrapping salt pork in brown paper. "Just for a day," Clara confirmed. "He's too stubborn to rest properly." Edith's shrewd eyes assessed Clara over her spectacles. "Stubbornness seems common at that ranch." Clara accepted the gentle probing with a small smile. "Perhaps it's catching." A comfortable silence fell as Edith continued assembling the order. Clara browsed the fabric bolts along one wall, allowing her fingers to trail over a deep blue cotton. "That would suit you," Edith observed. "Bring out your eyes." Clara withdrew her hand. "Perhaps another time." "Put it on Mr. Burke's account," a male voice interrupted. Both women turned to find Samuel standing in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright street beyond. Clara's surprise must have shown on her face. Samuel rarely came to town, preferring to send her or Miguel for supplies. 3 yards should suffice, he continued, addressing Edith while his eyes remained on Clara. "Samuel Burke making decisions about ladies' fabric," Edith commented, already measuring the cloth. "Never thought I'd see the day." Samuel stepped fully into the store, removing his hat. "Don't make too much of it, Edith. Just tired of seeing the same 2 dresses mended over and over." Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks, both at his unexpected presence and the realization he had noticed such details about her appearance. "I can pay for my own fabric," she said quietly, when Edith moved away to cut the material. "Consider it a bonus for saving my garden," Samuel replied. "Mrs. Abernathy would never forgive me if I let all her herbs wither." Before Clara could respond, the store's bell announced another customer. Sheriff Thomas Reeves entered, his badge catching the sunlight filtering through the windows. Clara stiffened instinctively, a reaction not lost on Samuel. "Burke," the sheriff acknowledged with a nod. "Rare sight in town." "Reeves," Samuel returned evenly. "Horse through a shoe. Thought I'd make use of the time while the blacksmith works." The sheriff's attention shifted to Clara, eyes narrowing slightly. "Your housekeeper, I presume. Don't believe we've been formally introduced." "Clara Mendoza," Samuel supplied before she could speak. "Clara, Sheriff Reeves." Clara inclined her head politely, keeping her eyes appropriately lowered. "Sheriff, Miss Mendoza." Reeves studied her with the practiced assessment of a lawman. "So you've been with Burke, 3 months now?" "Closer to 4, Samuel answered, moving subtly to position himself between Clara and the sheriff. Reeves noted the protective gesture with raised eyebrows. "Making quite an impression on the locals. Mrs. Abernathy sang your praises before leaving for Tucson." "She's a kind woman," Clara managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Indeed." Reeves maintained his scrutiny a moment longer before turning back to Samuel. "Heard from Peterson up north that strangers have been asking questions in Junction Springs. 3 men, well armed." Samuel's expression remained impassive, but Clara saw his shoulders tense slightly. "Junction Springs is 30 miles from here. Hardly our concern." "Maybe." Reeves shrugged. "Just thought you should know, given your history." The loaded pause hung in the air between the men. Clara watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing undercurrents she couldn't fully comprehend. "Appreciated," Samuel said finally, his tone dismissing further conversation. Reeves nodded, tipped his hat to Clara, and moved to the counter where Edith waited with deliberate patience. Samuel turned to Clara, his voice low. "Finish your shopping. I'll see to the wagon." She nodded, understanding his need to remove himself from the sheriff's presence. As Samuel left, Clara felt Reeves's eyes follow him, then returned to her with renewed interest. Clara completed her purchases with practiced efficiency, adding the blue fabric Samuel had insisted upon. Outside, she found him waiting with the wagon, his expression distant as he helped load her supplies. The ride back to the ranch unfolded in silence, both lost in their respective thoughts. Only when the town had disappeared behind them did Samuel speak. "The sheriff makes you nervous." It wasn't a question. Clara kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Lawmen make most people nervous. Most people haven't spent 4 months avoiding their gaze," Samuel observed. Clara's hands tightened on the fabric bundle in her lap. "You have questions?" "No," Samuel replied, surprising her. "But others will, eventually." The implication was clear. Whatever sanctuary she had found was potentially threatened. The fragile peace of recent months suddenly seemed as ephemeral as morning mist. "The men the sheriff mentioned," Clara said hesitantly. "Could they be looking for you?" Samuel's laugh held no humor. "My ghosts are older. These sound like new troubles." He glanced at her. "Yours, perhaps." Clara felt her breath catch. "I should leave," she whispered. "Running confirms guilt," Samuel said. "Staying offers the chance to face what comes on your own terms." "You sound experienced in such matters," Clara observed. Samuel's eyes remained on the road, but his voice softened. "I recognize the look of someone who left everything behind. I see it in my shaving mirror every morning." The simple admission unlocked something between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience that transcended the careful boundaries they had maintained. "I witnessed something I shouldn't have," Clara said finally, the words emerging like reluctant visitors. "In El Paso. Men with influence. Dangerous men." Samuel nodded, accepting her partial truth. "And now you're Clara Mendoza." She looked at him sharply. He met her gaze steadily, no judgment in his expression. "Names are just sounds we answer to," he said. "It's choices that define us." They completed the journey in silence, but it was different now, contemplative rather than tense. As they approached the ranch, the familiar silhouette of Shadow Mesa stood guard on the horizon, immutable and watchful. Clara found herself drawing strength from its presence, from the quiet steadiness of the man beside her, from the blue fabric in her lap that represented something she had almost forgotten. The possibility of a future worth planning for. The wagon rolled to a stop before the house they now shared. Samuel helped her down, his hands respectful but sure at her waist. For a moment, they stood close, the unspoken tension of the day's revelations hovering between them. "I'll make something special for dinner," Clara said finally, gathering her purchases. "To thank you for the fabric." Samuel's expression softened. "Blue was my mother's favorite color," he said simply, then turned to tend to the horses. Clara watched him go, understanding that he had shared another piece of himself, a memory offered in exchange for her own truth. Balance maintained between them, the scales of trust gradually equalizing with each careful disclosure. Inside the house, Clara placed the fabric on her bed, her fingers lingering on its texture. A dress of her own choosing, not born of necessity or disguise, a small step toward reclaiming identity, toward becoming someone who might have a place in this austere landscape. Beyond her window, the desert stretched toward Shadow Mesa, constant and unforgiving, yet strangely comforting in its permanence. Clara squared her shoulders, decision crystallizing within her. Samuel was right. Running only postponed the inevitable. Whatever came, she would face it here, on ground that had begun to feel, against all expectation, like home. The blue dress took shape over several evenings, Clara's fingers working by lamplight after dinner, while Samuel read in his chair by the fire. Their shared silence had evolved into something comfortable, broken occasionally by his turning pages or her soft humming as she sewed. On a Wednesday evening in late July, Clara held up the nearly completed dress, assessing her work with a critical eye. Only the hem and a few decorative touches remained to be finished. "It suits you," Samuel commented without looking up from his book. Clara lowered the fabric, surprised. She hadn't realized he was watching. "I haven't tried it on yet. Don't need to." Samuel marked his place and closed the book. "Some things you just know." The simple confidence in his assessment warmed her, more than the statement warranted. Over the months, Clara had come to value Samuel's straightforward observations, his economy of words that made those he chose to share more meaningful. "Thank you," she said, folding the dress carefully, "for the fabric, for everything." Samuel acknowledged her gratitude with a slight nod. He rose from his chair, moving to the window where the last light of day painted the desert in deepening shades of purple and gold. "Storm coming," he observed. "Feel it in the air." Clara set aside her sewing to join him. The distant horizon revealed a bank of clouds, bruised and heavy with promise. "The garden will welcome the rain." Samuel glanced at her, something unspoken in his expression. "Some storms bring more than rain." The cryptic statement hung between them. Before Clara could question it, a sound interrupted the evening quiet. Hoofbeats approaching at a steady pace. Samuel's posture changed instantly, tension replacing repose. "Stay inside," he instructed, moving toward the door. Clara followed despite his directive, anxiety propelling her forward. Through the window, she saw a rider approaching, Miguel, his horse lathered from hard riding. Samuel stepped onto the porch as Miguel reined his mount to a stop. The two men spoke in low voices that didn't carry to where Clara stood. She watched Samuel's expression darken, his shoulders squaring as if preparing to bear additional weight. When he returned inside, his face had settled into the impassive mask she remembered from her first days at the ranch. "Miguel saw 3 men in town," Samuel said without preamble, asking questions about newcomers, about a woman who might have arrived in the spring. The room seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. She steadied herself against the back of a chair, blood rushing in her ears. Did they give a name? Marisol Vega. Hearing her former name spoken aloud after so many months sent a physical shock through Clara's body. She sank into the chair, trembling fingers rising instinctively to touch the thimble at her throat. Samuel watched her reaction, confirmation of his suspicions written in her response. "These men, they're looking for you." It wasn't a question, but Clara nodded anyway. "Yes, the men from El Paso, the ones you witnessed doing something they shouldn't." "Yes," she whispered again. Samuel remained standing, his stance protective rather than accusatory. "Tell me what I need to know, Clara. Not for curiosity's sake, but for safety." Clara closed her eyes briefly, gathering fragmented courage. "When—" She spoke. Her voice emerged stronger than she expected. "I worked as a seamstress in El Paso, at a shop frequented by wealthy patrons." She traced the grain of the wooden table with one finger. "One night I was working late. 2 men came in, important men, business owners. They didn't see me behind the curtain in the back room." Samuel listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving her face. "They met with a 3rd man. There was an argument about territory, about shipments across the border." Clara's voice faltered. "The 3rd man didn't leave the shop alive." Understanding dawned in Samuel's expression. "You witnessed a murder." Clara nodded, the memory vivid despite her efforts to bury it. "They saw me as I tried to escape. I ran, took a different name, crossed the desert." Her eyes met his. "Found Aguamiel." "Found me," Samuel added quietly. "Yes." Clara's hand closed around the thimble. "I never meant to bring danger to your door." Samuel's expression softened. "Danger and I are old acquaintances." The simple statement contained volumes. Clara studied him with new understanding. "Your history with the sheriff, the reputation Mrs. Holloway mentioned." Samuel moved to sit across from her, his movements deliberate. "Before this ranch, before Aguamiel, I was someone else too." He paused. "Someone who wore a gun for reasons other than protection from coyotes." The confessions settled between them, another layer of truth unveiled. "You were a gunfighter," Clara said, pieces falling into place. "Among other things." Samuel's voice remained steady. The kind of man who made mothers hurry their children to the other side of the street. Clara considered this revelation, measuring it against the man she had come to know. The man who read philosophy by lamplight, who noticed when her dresses needed mending, who touched seedlings with unexpected gentleness. "That man is not who you are now," she said with quiet certainty. Something in Samuel's expression eased, as if her acceptance offered absolution he hadn't known he sought. Perhaps not, but he's the man these visitors will find if they bring trouble here. The protective intent behind his words warmed Clara, even as it frightened her. "I won't allow you to risk yourself for my sake." "Not your decision to make," Samuel replied, his tone brooking no argument. Outside, the first distant rumble of thunder punctuated his words. The storm was approaching, in more ways than one. "What will we do?" Clara asked, the plural emerging. "Naturally." Samuel's eyes held hers, the connection between them transcending employer and employee, transcending even friendship. "First, we prepare. Miguel will spread word that he hired a Mexican cousin to help his wife with their children. That explains your presence if anyone asks." Clara nodded, understanding the strategy. "And then? Then we wait." Samuel rose, moving to the cabinet where he kept his rifles. "And we watch." Clara stood as well, determination replacing fear. "I should leave. Draw them away from here." "Running won't save either of us now," Samuel said. "These men followed your trail for months. They won't stop until they find what they're looking for." "Or someone makes them stop," Clara added softly. Samuel turned to her, surprise and approval, mingling in his expression. Yes, their eyes held for a long moment, mutual understanding passing between them. They were no longer two solitary individuals maintaining careful distance, but allies joined by circumstance and choice. The first, drops of rain struck the roof, a gentle percussion that soon strengthened into steady drumming. Clara moved to close the windows against the coming downpour, her movements purposeful, despite the trembling she couldn't quite suppress. Samuel watched her, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. "We'll get through this, Clara." She turned to him, vulnerability and strength equally present in her gaze. "Together?" "Together," he confirmed, the single word a promise more binding than any contract between them. Outside, lightning illuminated the darkened landscape, revealing Shadow Mesa standing sentinel against the storm-swept sky. Clara drew strength from its immutable presence, from the quiet certainty of the man whose life had become inexorably entwined with hers. Whatever came with the dawn, they would face it not as employer and housekeeper, not as former gunslinger and fugitive witness, but as two people who had found in each other something worth protecting, the fragile possibility of redemption, of belonging, of home. August arrived with merciless heat, the land baking beneath the relentless sun. Clara and Samuel settled into hypervigilance disguised as routine, each maintaining their usual tasks, while eyes constantly scanned horizons, ears attuned to the slightest disturbance. Miguel brought news from town every few days. The strangers had taken rooms at the small hotel, making inquiries throughout Aguamiel with thinly veiled threats accompanying their questions. Sheriff Reeves watched but didn't interfere, citing lack of cause despite the men's obvious weaponry and intimidating presence. "Coward," Samuel muttered, when Miguel relayed this information. "Or bought." Clara looked up from the vegetables she was preparing for dinner. "What do they look like?" "The men." Miguel hesitated, glancing at Samuel, who nodded permission. "Two are common types, rough, like hired guns," Miguel explained in his accented English. "But the third—" He frowned, searching for words. "Elegant. Expensive clothes, soft hands but hard eyes. He does the talking while the others watch." Clara's knife stilled. "Jenkins," she whispered. Samuel turned to her. "You know him?" "Howard Jenkins. He owns businesses in El Paso." Clara's voice strengthened with anger. "Legal ones that hide the others. He was one of the men that night." Miguel crossed himself. "They ask many questions about Shadow Mesa Ranch, about who lives here." Samuel's expression hardened. "They'll come eventually, when their patience runs out." Or when someone talks, Clara added, the unspoken fear giving weight to her words. After Miguel left, Samuel moved methodically through the house, checking windows, doors, sightlines. Clara watched him, recognizing the economy of movement that spoke of experience rather than panic. "Second rifle is in my closet," he said without looking at her. "Ammunition in the box beneath." Clara dried her hands on her apron. "I don't know. How to shoot?" Samuel paused, turning to face her fully. "Then it's time you learned." That evening, as the worst heat dissipated, Samuel led Clara to a clearing behind the barn. He placed an old tin can on a fence post 20 paces away, then returned to hand her a weathered Winchester rifle. "This was my first," he explained, his voice softening with memory. "Lighter than the others, better for your frame." Clara accepted the weapon with appropriate reverence, feeling its weight, its potential for both protection and destruction. With patient hands, Samuel guided her through the basics: how to hold the rifle, how to sight along the barrel, how to account for distance and wind. His touch was impersonal, yet somehow intimate, adjusting her stance with gentle pressure against her shoulder, steadying her arms with his own. "Breathe out as you squeeze the trigger," he instructed, his voice close to her ear. "Never pull, just squeeze like you're testing a ripe peach." Clara followed his guidance, surprised when the rifle's report was followed by the distant ping. "So have the can flying from its perch." "I hit it," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. Samuel's rare smile appeared. "Good eye. Try again." They continued until dusk made further practice impossible. Clara's shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil, but satisfaction outweighed discomfort. She had hit the target more often than not, a small victory against helplessness. As they walked back to the house, rifles carried with new familiarity, Samuel spoke quietly. "You're a natural. Not many are their first time." The praise warmed her. "I had a good teacher." Samuel glanced at her, something unspoken in his expression. "Knowledge like this changes a person. Using it changes them more." Clara understood he wasn't speaking only of marksmanship. "I've already changed," she said softly. "The woman who fled El Paso wouldn't recognize who I am now." "And who are you now?" Samuel asked, the question containing no challenge, only genuine interest. Clara considered, watching the last light gild the distant mesa. "Someone who stopped. Running," she answered finally. "Someone who's found something worth standing ground for." Samuel nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. "That's a beginning." That night, Clara completed the blue dress, adding the final stitches with careful precision. She held it up in the lamplight, admiring her handiwork. The gentle gathers at the waist, the modest neckline with its delicate embroidery of desert flowers worked in white thread. A dress for the woman she was becoming, not the woman she had been. She laid it aside carefully, then moved to the small window of her room. The night stretched calm and clear, stars scattered like salt across the velvet darkness. Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the horizon, its steadfast presence a comfort. A soft knock at her door startled her from contemplation. "Clara?" Samuel's voice pitched low. She opened the door to find him standing with a small wooden box in his hands. "May I come in?" he asked, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his tone. Clara stepped aside, keenly aware of the impropriety of a man in her bedroom, yet equally aware that conventional proprieties had long since ceased to govern their relationship. Samuel entered, his tall frame making the small room seem even more confined. He placed the box on her small table, then stepped back, hands resting awkwardly at his sides. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said. "Seems the right time now." Clara approached the box curiously. At Samuel's nod of encouragement, she opened it to reveal a revolver nestled in faded velvet. Smaller than his, clearly designed for a woman's hand, with pearl inlay on the grip and intricate engraving along the barrel. "Samuel," she breathed, both awed and disturbed by its deadly beauty. "It was my mother's," he explained, watching her reaction carefully. "The West was no kinder to women in her day than it is now." Clara lifted the weapon gingerly, feeling its perfect balance. "I can't accept this. It's a family heirloom." "You're..." The only one I'd trust with it, Samuel said simply. The statement hung between them, weighted with implications neither was prepared to address directly. Clara returned the revolver to its box, then looked up to meet Samuel's gaze. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me." Samuel nodded, his eyes holding hers for a long moment. "The rifle is for distance," he said finally, returning to practicalities. "This is for when distance fails." The reminder of imminent danger sobered them both. Samuel moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "We'll practice with it tomorrow," he said. "Sleep well, Clara." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, the revolver box open beside her, the blue dress draped across her lap. Symbols of her transformation, from hunted to defender, from transient to someone with roots however fragile in this harsh landscape. Outside her window, an owl called into the vast night. Clara thought of the men in town, of Howard, Jenkins with his cultured voice and murderer's heart. Fear flickered at the edges of her consciousness, but it no longer consumed her as it once had. She closed the revolver box and placed it beneath her pillow, then carefully hung the blue dress on a peg on the wall. Tomorrow she would wear it, for the first time. Tomorrow she would learn to shoot Samuel's mother's revolver, small acts of defiance against those who thought her powerless. Clara extinguished her lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the creaks and sighs of the house settling around her. Beyond her door, she heard Samuel's measured footsteps as he completed his nightly circuit, checking locks, windows, the placement of weapons within easy reach. The vigilance of a man who understood danger intimately. The vigilance of a man determined to protect what was his. The thought accompanied Clara into uneasy dreams, where Shadow Mesa loomed protective against gathering storms, and Samuel stood, sentinel at its base, rifle in hand, watching the horizon for approaching riders. Sunday dawned with eerie calm, the air unusually still, heavy with premonition. Clara dressed in her blue dress for the first time, the fabric cool against her skin as she fastened the row of small buttons. The woman who gazed back from the small mirror above her wash basin seemed a stranger, composed, purposeful, eyes clear with resolve rather than clouded by fear. She secured her mother's thimble around her neck, then hesitated before opening. The wooden box beneath her pillow, the pearl-handled revolver gleamed in the early light. Clara lifted it carefully, checking that it was loaded as Samuel had shown her, before slipping it into the special pocket she had sewn into her dress the previous evening. When she emerged from her room, Samuel stood at the stove, coffee in hand. He turned at her entrance, his expression shifting subtly as he took in her appearance. "The dress suits you," he said, his voice carrying an undertone she couldn't quite interpret. "Thank you." Clara moved to pour her own coffee, aware of his eyes following her movement. They breakfasted in companionable silence, the familiar routine, belying the tension humming beneath ordinary gestures. When they finished, Samuel rose to collect his hat. "I'll check the north fence line," he said. "Back by noon." Clara nodded, understanding his need to survey their surroundings, to ensure no approach went unnoticed. "I'll prepare a cold dinner." "Too hot for cooking today." Samuel paused at the door, looking back at her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "The blue," he said finally. "It brings out something in your eyes. Something that was always there, just waiting." Before Clara could respond to the unexpected observation, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. She stood motionless in the kitchen, his words echoing in her mind, not mere flattery but recognition of the transformation that had gradually occurred within her. The morning passed with deceptive normalcy. Clara tended the garden, harvesting vegetables for their evening meal, her movements deliberate despite the watchfulness that had become second nature. The revolver's weight against her thigh provided strange comfort as she worked. Mid-morning brought the distant sound of hoofbeats. Clara straightened from her gardening, hand instinctively moving toward her hidden weapon. Tension eased slightly when she recognized Miguel's familiar figure approaching on horseback. His usually cheerful face was grave as he dismounted. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "The three men left town an hour ago riding east. Sheriff Reeves watched them go and did nothing." Clara's heart stuttered, then steadied. "Samuel is checking the north fence line. Miguel nodded understanding. "I will find him. You should not be alone when they come." "I'll be fine," Clara assured him with more confidence than she felt. "Just tell Samuel to hurry back." After Miguel departed, Clara moved purposefully through the house, checking windows, securing what could be secured. Samuel's rifle stood ready by the door, loaded as he had taught her. The revolver pressed reassuringly against her leg as she moved. Outside, the day's unnatural stillness persisted, as if the desert itself held its breath in anticipation. Clara stood on the porch, scanning the eastern horizon, where dust might betray approaching riders. Shadow Mesa stood unchanged, its weathered face indifferent to human concerns. The sound came from behind her, a horse's soft nicker from the direction of the barn. Clara turned, her blood chilling at the realization that riders could have approached from the west, using the arroyo for cover. Howard Jenkins stood 30 paces away, flanked by his 2 hired guns. Unlike his companions, dust didn't cling to his fine clothes, as if even the desert respected his authority. His smile, when he spotted Clara, held genuine pleasure beneath its predatory edge. "Miss Vega," he called, using her former name with deliberate emphasis. "Or do you prefer Mendoza now? How provincial?" Clara remained on the porch, one hand resting casually near the door where Samuel's rifle waited. "Mr. Jenkins, you're a long way from El Paso. Business demands personal attention sometimes." Jenkins removed his hat, revealing hair prematurely silver at the temples. Particularly unfinished business. The hired guns flanking him maintained watchful silence, their hands resting near holstered weapons. Clara catalogued details with surprising clarity. One tall and angular, the other shorter but powerfully built, both with the flat eyes of men who killed without conscience. "What business could possibly bring you to this forgotten corner of the territory?" Clara asked, playing for time, praying Samuel would return soon. Jenkins smiled, appreciating her attempt at composure. "You witnessed something unfortunate, Miss Vega. Something that cannot be allowed to reach certain ears. I've told no one," Clara said, the half-truth steady on her lips. "Yet," Jenkins corrected, "you've told no one yet. But intention sits in your eyes, my dear. Always has." He sighed, a parody of regret. "I admired your skills with a needle. Such precision, such attention to detail, qualities I value in my associates." Clara's fingers brushed the thimble at her throat. "I was never your associate." "No," Jenkins agreed, his smile fading. "Just a complication requiring resolution." He gestured to his companions. "Check the house, find Burke." The taller man dismounted, moving toward the porch with practiced menace. Clara's hand moved to her hidden pocket, fingers closing around the pearl grip of Samuel's mother's revolver. "Mr. Burke isn't here," she said, voice steady despite her racing heart. "A fortunate circumstance," Jenkins remarked. "I've heard stories about Samuel Burke's younger days. Better for everyone if this concludes without his involvement." As the hired gun reached the porch steps, Clara withdrew the revolver, its appearance halting his advance. "That's far enough," she said, the weapon steady in her hand. Jenkins laughed, genuine amusement lighting his features. "My dear Miss Vega, do you imagine you can shoot all 3 of us before we respond in kind?" "She doesn't have to." Samuel's voice came from beyond the barn. "She just has to shoot you." All heads turned to find Samuel approaching on foot, rifle raised and aimed with unwavering precision at Jenkins. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, no wasted motion, no hesitation in his stride or his aim. "Mr. Burke," Jenkins acknowledged, his composure slipping momentarily. "Your reputation precedes you." "Yours doesn't," Samuel replied coldly. "Just another man hiding behind hired guns and money." The standoff crystallized in the desert heat, Clara on the porch with her revolver, Samuel approaching from the side. With his rifle, Jenkins and his men caught in the crossfire. The shorter gunman moved subtly, hand edging toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Samuel advised, his voice carrying deadly calm. "Been a while since I've shot a man, but some skills don't fade." Jenkins raised a placating hand. "Gentlemen, please, Miss Vega and I were just discussing a private matter." "Her name is Clara Mendoza," Samuel corrected, continuing his measured approach until he stood level with Clara on the porch. "And there's nothing to discuss. You're trespassing on my property. The law takes a dim view of harboring witnesses who flee questioning, Jenkins countered, his urbane manner returning. Sheriff Reeves seemed quite interested when I mentioned Miss Vega's sudden departure from El Paso. Clara's grip tightened on the revolver. After I witnessed you murder a man in cold blood. Jenkins sighed dramatically. Allegations without proof, my dear. Your word against mine. And in this territory, whose word do you imagine carries more weight? A seamstress of questionable background, or a respected businessman with connections in territorial government? The brutal truth of his assessment hung in the air. Clara felt Samuel shift slightly beside her, his presence solid and reassuring despite the danger surrounding them. This doesn't end how you think it does, Jenkins, Samuel said quietly. Not today. Jenkins studied him with calculating eyes. The famous Samuel Burke. They say you killed 12 men before retiring to this charming wasteland. 14, Samuel corrected without emotion. Now please remove yourself from my property while that number remains unchanged. A tense silence descended, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Clara stood immobile, revolver unwavering despite the trembling she felt beginning in her core. Finally, Jenkins replaced his hat with deliberate precision. Another time, perhaps, when circumstances are more favorable, he turned to his men. We're leaving. The hired guns exchanged glances but followed his lead, remounting their horses with obvious reluctance. Jenkins tipped his hat to Clara with mocking courtesy. Do consider my offer, Miss Vega. Silence can be quite valuable when properly compensated. More valuable than other arrangements. His gaze flicked meaningfully between Clara and Samuel. Goodbye, Mr. Jenkins, Clara replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. They watched in tense silence as the three riders departed, taking the western trail that would eventually lead back to town. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Clara lower the revolver, her arm suddenly leaden with delayed reaction. Samuel's hand covered hers, gently removing the weapon from her trembling fingers. You did well, he said quietly. Clara turned to face him, emotion finally breaking through her composed facade. They'll be back. Yes. Samuel didn't soften the truth with false reassurance. But we'll be ready. His eyes held hers, communication passing between them that transcended words, recognition of the boundary they had crossed, standing together against a common threat, choosing each other's safety over prudence or self-preservation. The blue. Suits you, Samuel said finally, echoing his earlier observation. Brings out the fire. Clara glanced down at her dress, now christened in confrontation rather than celebration. Strange to face death in something so carefully made, she murmured. Not strange at all, Samuel replied. What we make with our own hands is what we fight to protect. The simple philosophy contained a deeper truth that resonated through Clara's being. She had made not just a dress, but a life here, tended gardens, prepared meals, created order and beauty in this harsh landscape. Had made perhaps the beginning of a home. Samuel's hand brushed hers briefly, the touch grounding her racing thoughts. Come inside, he said. We need to plan. Clara nodded, following him into the house that had become sanctuary, and now stood as fortress. Outside, the unnatural stillness had broken, wind rising to whisper warnings through the chaparral. Storm clouds gathered over Shadow Mesa, promising change, promising cleansing, promising resolution one way or another. The next 3 days unfolded in a strange limbo of vigilance and routine. Clara and Samuel maintained their usual patterns. She cooking and tending the garden, he seeing to livestock and repairs, while never straying far from each other or from loaded weapons placed strategically throughout the house. Miguel brought news that Jenkins and his men remained in town, their presence a constant reminder of unfinished business. Sheriff Reeves had questioned Samuel's housekeeper's background, but taken no official action, a calculated waiting game that Samuel interpreted with grim understanding. Reeves is testing which way the wind blows, he explained to Clara as they sat on the porch after dinner, the evening breeze offering respite from the day's heat. He won't move against Jenkins' money unless forced. Clara's hands stilled in her mending. Or against your reputation. Samuel acknowledged her perception with a slight nod. Old ghosts cast long shadows. Yet you've lived here peacefully for years, Clara observed, built something honest with your hands. Not all believe in redemption, Samuel replied, his gaze fixed on the darkening mesa. Some see only what a man was, never what he's become. Clara set aside her sewing, turning to face him fully. And what have you become, Samuel Burke? The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. In the fading light, his features softened from their usual stoic lines. A man who wants quiet days and dreamless nights, he answered finally. A man who thought he'd buried his past deep enough that it wouldn't follow. Until I brought mine. To your door, Clara said softly. Samuel's eyes met hers. Some burdens are worth carrying. The simple statement hung between them, weighted with meaning neither was prepared to articulate fully. Clara felt something shift in her chest, a certainty taking root where doubt had flourished. I won't run again, she said, the declaration, both promise and realization. Samuel studied her, approval warming his gaze. Good. They sat in companionable silence, as darkness claimed the landscape, each lost in private thoughts, yet connected by shared purpose. When Clara finally rose to retire, Samuel's voice stopped her at the door. Clara. He rarely used her name, making its utterance significant. Whatever comes, we face it together. She turned back, finding him outlined against the star-scattered sky. Together, she agreed, the word a covenant between them. The fourth morning dawned beneath ominous clouds, the air heavy with impending rain. Clara woke with a sense of foreboding that persisted as she dressed and moved to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Samuel joined her, his expression suggesting he shared her unease. Storm's coming, he observed, glancing toward the window where dark clouds massed on the horizon. Yes, Clara agreed, understanding he spoke of more than weather. They ate in contemplative silence, the atmosphere charged with anticipation. When Miguel arrived earlier than usual, his agitated demeanor confirmed their apprehension. Sheriff Reeves is coming, he reported breathlessly, with Jenkins and his men. And others, townspeople. Samuel's expression hardened. A posse without legal standing. They say they come for the woman, Miguel continued, his worried gaze shifting to Clara. Jenkins has convinced many she is a fugitive from justice. Clara felt cold certainty settle in her stomach. He's turned the town against us, against strangers, Samuel corrected. Aguamiel protects its own first. He rose, moving with deliberate calm to collect his rifle. Miguel, take your family to your brother's place north of here. Stay until this is resolved. Miguel hesitated, loyalty warring with concern for his family's safety. You have been good to us, Mr. Burke. Then live to work another season, Samuel replied firmly. Go now. After Miguel's departure, Samuel turned to Clara, his expression grave but determined. Last chance to run, he offered, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. Clara straightened her shoulders, her decision unwavering. My place is here. Something like pride flickered in Samuel's eyes. He nodded once, then outlined his strategy with tactical precision. They'll come from the East Road. We'll position ourselves to see them coming. I'll speak to Reeves alone first. There's still a chance he'll listen to reason. And if he doesn't, Clara asked. Samuel's expression hardened. Then we show them leaving is safer than staying. The preparations were methodical, weapons checked and positioned, escape routes confirmed, water and provisions secured in case retreat to the barn became necessary. Throughout it all, Clara moved with surprising calm, her earlier terror transformed into focused resolve. When the distant sound of multiple riders reached them, Samuel and Clara took their positions. He on the porch with his rifle visible but not threatening, she inside with a clear view through the window, Samuel's mother's revolver steady in her hand. The approaching party materialized through the dust, Sheriff Reeves leading, flanked by Jenkins and his 2 hired guns, followed by a half-dozen townsmen, some looking uncomfortable with their role, others eager for confrontation. Samuel stepped forward as they halted in the yard, his stance relaxed but vigilant. "Quite a reception committee, Sheriff. Something I should know." Reeves dismounted, his expression trapped between duty and discomfort. "Got questions about your housekeeper, Burke? Miss Vega or Mendoza or whatever name she's using now." "Her name is Clara Mendoza," Samuel replied evenly. "She works for me. Has for months. That's all you need to know." Jenkins urged his horse forward, his cultured voice carrying across the yard. "Miss Vega is wanted for questioning in El Paso regarding a serious matter. As a law-abiding citizen, Mr. Burke, surely you understand the importance of cooperating with authorities." "I see a sheriff," Samuel observed coolly, "and hired guns, and concerned citizens. What I don't see is legal documentation supporting your claims." Reeves shifted uncomfortably. "Jenkins has sworn statements from himself." "No doubt," Samuel interrupted. "Not good enough, Thomas, not on my land." The use of the sheriff's first name reminded everyone present of Samuel's standing in the community, despite his isolation. He had been in Aguamiel longer than most, had earned, if not friendship, then at least respect, through years of quiet industry. Jenkins' pleasant mask slipped momentarily. The woman witnessed a private business discussion that she misinterpreted. Her confusion could damage reputations unnecessarily. "Murder isn't a business discussion." Clara's voice rang clear as she stepped onto the porch beside Samuel, her blue dress a defiant splash of color against the weathered wood. A murmur ran through the assembled men. Clara stood straight, her fear transmuted into dignified certainty. "I saw Howard Jenkins and his associate murder a man in cold blood because he threatened their smuggling operation. I ran because I knew what happens to witnesses who speak against powerful men." Jenkins' affable expression hardened. "Malicious? Slander from a woman of questionable character. Hardly evidence. I believe her," Samuel said simply, his quiet declaration carrying more weight than impassioned argument. Reeves looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between Jenkins' influence and the growing uncertainty among the townsmen who had accompanied them. "Burke," the sheriff began, "don't make this more difficult." "It's already difficult," Samuel cut him off. "You've brought armed men to my property based on unsubstantiated claims. You've threatened a woman under my protection. Where does this end, Thomas?" The question hung in the tense air. Jenkins' hired guns had subtly adjusted their positions, hands hovering near weapons. The townsmen exchanged uneasy glances, some beginning to question their participation. "It ends with Miss Vega returning to El Paso to clarify her statements," Jenkins insisted, his cultured tone fraying at the edges. "Anything else would be obstruction of justice." "There's no justice in what you're proposing," Clara replied steadily. "Only convenience." Thunder rumbled in the distance, the approaching storm echoing the tension in the yard. The first scattered raindrops began to fall, darkening the dust in random patterns. Samuel's voice remained calm, but carried an undercurrent of steel that reminded everyone present of the man he had once been. "I'm asking you all to leave my property, now, before decisions are made that can't be unmade." One of Jenkins' hired guns, the taller one, moved his hand to his holster. "Seems to me the decision's already made. The woman comes with us, or what?" Samuel interrupted, his rifle shifting almost imperceptibly. The atmosphere crystallized with lethal potential. Clara felt time slow, each heartbeat distinct as she watched the tableau before her, Samuel standing relaxed, yet deadly alert. Jenkins calculating his options, Reeves trapped in indecision. The townsmen increasingly uncertain of their role in this confrontation. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, until Edith Holloway's voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough," the shopkeeper announced, urging her wagon forward through the assembled men. She pulled to a stop and fixed Sheriff Reeves with a withering glare. "Thomas Reeves, your father would be ashamed to see you standing with this snake." Jenkins turned to her with forced charm. "Mrs. Holloway, this doesn't concern—" "Quiet, you!" Edith snapped with surprising authority. "I've received a telegram from my cousin in El Paso." She withdrew a paper from her pocket. "Seems Mr. Jenkins here is wanted for questioning himself about missing shipments and a partner who disappeared rather suddenly." A murmur ran through the townsmen. Jenkins's composure slipped further. "Preposterous," Judge Wilson remembers. You, Mr. Burke, Edith continued, addressing Samuel while ignoring Jenkins' protest, says your testimony would be welcomed if you have information pertinent to the investigation. Understanding passed between them. Edith was offering more than information. She was offering legitimacy, community support, a chance to resolve the situation through proper channels rather than violence. Samuel nodded slightly, acknowledgement and gratitude in the gesture. Miss Mendoza and I would be happy to provide statements to Judge Wilson. The balance of power had shifted palpably. The townsmen began to back away from Jenkins and his men, aligning themselves with Edith's wagon instead. Sheriff Reeves, sensing the change, straightened his shoulders and found his authority. Mr. Jenkins, he said formally, I believe we should continue this discussion in town. These new developments warrant attention. Jenkins' careful facade crumbled, revealing the calculating ruthlessness beneath. He glanced at his hired guns, a silent communication passing between them. For a moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then the heavens opened, rain falling in earnest. Sudden drenching downpour that seemed to wash away pretense and hesitation. Lightning split the sky above Shadow Mesa, thunder following instantly in deafening response. The desert passes judgment, Clara murmured, her voice audible only to Samuel. He glanced at her, surprise and appreciation mingling in his expression. So it does. In the confusion of the sudden storm, Jenkins and his men wheeled their horses, breaking away from the group to ride hard toward the western trail. Sheriff Reeves shouted and moved as if to follow, but the rain and their head start made pursuit impractical. Let them go, Samuel advised, his rifle lowered now but still ready. They won't get far. Edith Holloway climbed down from her wagon, surprisingly spry for her age, and approached the porch where Clara and Samuel stood. The remaining townsmen followed, seeking shelter from the intensifying storm. That telegram, Samuel said quietly as Edith reached them. The shopkeeper's eyes twinkled with mischief beneath her stern expression. Came this morning. Fortunate. Timing. Very fortunate, Samuel agreed, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Clara stepped forward, emotion threatening to overwhelm her composure. Mrs. Holloway, Edith, I don't know how to thank you. Edith waved away her gratitude. Girl who makes a dress like that deserves better than being hounded by the likes of Jenkins. She glanced between Clara and Samuel, shrewd assessment in her gaze. Besides, seems to me you've brought more life to this place than it's seen in years. The simple observation carried more significance than its surface meaning. Samuel's hand moved to rest lightly at the small of Clara's back, a public acknowledgement of connection that would not have been possible days earlier. The storm continued, unabated, rain transforming the parched earth, washing away dust and deception alike. Inside the house, temporary community formed as the townsmen shed their uncertain alliance with Jenkins and accepted Clara's hospitality. Coffee brewed, stories shared, bridges built between isolation and belonging. Through it all, Clara moved. With newfound confidence, her blue dress a statement of identity reclaimed. Samuel watched her from across the room, his customary reserve softened by something that looked remarkably like pride. When their eyes met across the crowded space, understanding passed between them, a shared recognition that the storm had washed away more than dust, had cleansed more than the land, had offered perhaps the chance for something neither had dared to imagine, a future unbound by past shadows. Outside, rain continued to fall on Shadow Mesa, the ancient formation standing unchanged, yet somehow transformed by the desert's cleansing judgment. 2 weeks after the confrontation at Shadow Mesa Ranch, Clara sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. Autumn's first breath had tempered summer's ferocity, bringing pleasant coolness to the mornings and a sense of transition to the land. Sheriff Reeves had telegraphed authorities in El Paso immediately after Jenkins and his men fled. Word returned that Jenkins had not appeared at his businesses or home. Some speculated he had crossed into Mexico to escape mounting evidence of his criminal enterprises. Others believed he would regroup and return. Vigilance remained necessary, but immediate danger had passed. Clara's pen moved across the paper with deliberate strokes, recording events she had once fled but now faced directly. To Judge Wilson, District Court of El Paso County, I write. To provide testimony regarding events I witnessed, on the night of April 17th at Madame Fournier's dress shop, where I was employed as a seamstress. Samuel entered quietly, pausing in the doorway to observe her concentrated expression. Clara had changed in subtle yet significant ways since the confrontation, her posture more assured, her voice steadier, her gaze meeting others directly rather than sliding away. The woman who had stumbled into Aguamiel seeking anonymity had found instead a self-worth claiming. "Tea," he offered, moving to the stove. Clara looked up with a smile. "Please." Their domestic rhythm had evolved as well, boundaries softening while respect remained. Samuel placed a steaming cup beside her, glancing at the neat handwriting covering the page. "Difficult task," he observed. Clara set down her pen, flexing fingers cramped from writing. "Necessary, though. I can't truly start anew while the past remains unaddressed." Samuel nodded approval, facing ghosts rather than fleeing them. "I had a good example," Clara replied, her eyes meeting his with meaning that transcended the simple words. Samuel acknowledged the compliment with a slight incline of his head. He took a seat across from her, his own cup warming his hands. "Sheriff Reeves received confirmation this morning. Jenkins' operation is being dismantled by federal authorities. His associates are cooperating to save themselves." Relief washed through Clara. "Then my testimony will help ensure he can't rebuild elsewhere." "Yes." Samuel studied her over the rim of his cup. "What will you do after, when this is truly finished?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Clara's fingers found the thimble at her throat, the familiar gesture now one of contemplation rather than anxiety. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long, survival was my only goal. I never allowed myself to consider beyond the next day, the next week." "And now?" Samuel prompted gently. Clara's gaze moved to the window where Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the morning sky. "Now I find myself thinking of seasons, watching the garden through winter, planning spring plantings, preserving summer's harvest." Her eyes returned to his. "I find myself thinking of permanence." Something in Samuel's expression eased, as if a question long held had found its answer. "The land has a way of claiming those who belong to it," he said quietly. Clara nodded, understanding flowing between them. "Yes, it does." Before either could elaborate, hoofbeats announced a visitor. Samuel rose, moving to the window with habitual caution that persisted, despite reduced threat. "A Miguel," he identified, tension leaving his shoulders. Their foreman had returned to work the day after the confrontation, his loyalty to Samuel strengthened by the events. He entered carrying a small wooden crate, his expression bright with excitement. "From Mrs. Abernathy in Tucson," he explained, placing the package on the table. "The stage brought it to town yesterday." Clara opened the crate carefully, revealing nestle cuttings from Mrs. Abernathy's prized roses, wrapped in damp cloth to preserve them during travel. A letter accompanied the gift. "Dear Clara, Edith writes that you've brought the garden and Samuel back to life. These cuttings are from roses my grandmother brought from Virginia. They're survivors, like you. Plant them by the east porch where morning sun will reach them first. With care, they'll outlive us all. Samuel Burke is a good man who has carried solitude long enough. I'm pleased he's found someone worthy of sharing his hard-won peace. Visit when you can. Tucson has fine fabric shops that would benefit from your skill with a needle. With affection, Abigail Abernathy." Clara handed the letter to Samuel, watching as he read the older woman's forthright observations. A faint color touched his cheekbones, but he didn't dispute Mrs. Abernathy's characterization. "She always did speak her mind," he commented, returning the letter. Clara smiled, fingers gently touching the rose cuttings. "Where should we plant them?" "East porch," Samuel replied without hesitation. "Mrs. Abernathy knows her roses." The simple exchange contained layers of meaning, acknowledgement of shared future, of collaboration, of trust in each other's judgment. Miguel observed their interaction with quiet satisfaction before excusing himself to tend the horses. When he had gone, Samuel remained standing beside Clara, unusual hesitation in his normally decisive manner. "I've been meaning to show you something," he said finally. "If you have time this afternoon." Clara nodded, curious at his uncharacteristic uncertainty. Of course. Several hours later, they rode side by side through the northern portion of Samuel's property, an area Clara had not yet explored. The landscape changed subtly as they progressed. More trees appearing, the ground less arid, signs of water nearby. They crested a gentle rise, and Clara gasped at the view that spread before them. A small valley nestled between protective hills, sheltered from harsh winds and extreme temperatures. A creek meandered through its center, bordered by cottonwoods and willows. Near the water stood the partial framework of a house, foundation laid, some walls erected, construction apparently halted partway through. Samuel dismounted, helping Clara from her horse with gentle hands. They stood surveying the scene, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of water and possibility. "I began building 5 years ago," Samuel explained, leading her toward the unfinished structure. "Intended it to be the main house eventually. Better location, water, shelter, good soil." Clara followed him through the partially constructed room's imagination filling in walls and windows, seeing what could be rather than what was. "Why did you stop?" she asked softly. Samuel ran a hand along a rough-hewn beam. "Realized I was building for a family I didn't have. Seemed pointless to create a home meant for sharing when I'd chosen solitude." The simple confession contained volumes, loneliness acknowledged, dreams deferred, choices questioned. Clara moved to stand beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as they gazed through the open framework to the creek beyond. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, "full of potential." Samuel turned to her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "That's why I wanted you to see it, to ask if you think it worth finishing." The question behind the question hung in the air between them. Clara met his gaze steadily, understanding all he wasn't saying directly. "Yes," she answered simply. "With a few changes, perhaps. Larger windows to catch the morning light, a proper kitchen garden just there." She pointed toward a sunny patch near where the kitchen would be, and Mrs. Abernathy's roses along the front path. Samuel's smile emerged slowly, transforming his weathered features. "You have definite opinions on the matter." "I do," Clara acknowledged, returning his smile. "The woman who arrived at your door 4 months ago wouldn't have dared express them. She was too busy hiding, too afraid to want anything beyond safety." "And now?" Samuel asked, his voice softening. Clara's hand found his, fingers intertwining with deliberate intent. "Now, I find myself planning for springs and autumns yet to come, considering what might grow here, what might be built." Her eyes held his. "What might be shared?" Samuel's free hand rose to touch her cheek gently. "Clara Mendoza," he said, her name almost a benediction on his lips. "Would you consider making this your home? Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." The directness of his proposal, so characteristic of the man, brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. "You know so little about me," she whispered. "I know what matters," Samuel replied. "I know your courage, your resilience, your capacity for growth and change." His thumb brushed away a tear that had escaped. "I know that when you arrived, this land was just a place I owned. Now it feels like home." Clara leaned into his touch, the simple contact more intimate than any they had shared before. "Yes," she said, the single syllable containing multitudes. "Yes, I will." Samuel's kiss was gentle, tentative, despite his usual certainty, a question rather than a claim. Clara answered by drawing closer, her hand rising to rest against his chest, where his heartbeat matched the accelerated rhythm of her own. When they parted, the world seemed transformed, the unfinished house now filled with possibility, the valley alive with promise, the future unfolding before them like the pages of a book yet to be written. "We should return," Samuel said eventually, though reluctance colored his tone. Storm clouds gathering to the west, they rode back toward the ranch house side by side, comfortable silence between them. Shadow Mesa watched their approach, its ancient presence a reminder of permanence amid change, of endurance through seasons of both hardship and joy. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching lightning play along distant horizons, Clara's hand found Samuel's in the gathering darkness. No words were necessary as their fingers intertwined, a simple connection that spoke of choices made, paths chosen, futures envisioned together rather than apart. The desert wind carried the scent of rain not yet fallen, of earth prepared to receive whatever the heavens might bestow. Clara breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the promise of renewal. Beside her, Samuel squeezed her hand gently, anchor and companion, protector and equal. Together they watched the approaching storm, no longer fearing what it might bring, but welcoming the cleansing, transformative power of nature's cycles. Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the lightning-illuminated sky, unchanged, yet bearing witness to the changes unfolding in its protective shadow. A woman reclaiming her true self, a man rediscovering connection, two solitary souls finding in each other the courage to begin again. Winter descended on Aguamiel with unexpected gentleness, the harsh extremes of desert climate softened by unusually regular rains. The land transformed beneath the moisture, dormant seeds awakening, subtle greens emerging where brown had dominated, life persisting despite the season of rest. Construction on the Valley House progressed steadily through December and January. Samuel worked alongside the men he had hired from Junction Springs, his experience guiding their efforts as walls rose and a roof took shape. Miguel's brothers contributed their skills as well, crafting doors and window frames from seasoned wood Samuel had stored in anticipation of this revival. Clara divided her time between maintaining the ranch house and planning for their future home. Each decision, from the placement of windows to the arrangement of rooms, became an act of claiming space, of envisioning life beyond mere survival. She worked on furnishings as well, repurposing items from the ranch house and creating new pieces, curtains sewn from fabric ordered specially from Tucson, quilts pieced together during long evening hours, a kitchen table built to her specifications by Miguel's eldest brother. Their wedding had been simple but meaningful, held in mid-November at Edith Holloway's insistence that they stop living in sin and make things proper. The small ceremony in Aguamiel's modest church had been attended by the handful of people who had transformed from neighbors to friends. Edith, Miguel and his family, Sheriff Reeves, now firmly allied with Samuel after the Jenkins affair, and Mrs. Abernathy, who had traveled from Tucson specifically for the occasion. Clara had worn her blue dress, now associated with courage rather than confrontation. Samuel had appeared in a new black suit that softened his rugged appearance without diminishing his inherent strength. Their vows, though traditional in structure, carried the weight of experience, promises made with full understanding of both frailty and fortitude, of the effort required to build something lasting in unforgiving terrain. The transition from housekeeper to wife had occurred with surprising ease. The boundaries they had established during months of cautious coexistence evolved naturally into the rhythms of marriage, separate yet connected, independent yet interdependent, each maintaining individual strength while creating something greater together. On a clear February morning, Clara stood in what would become the kitchen of their new home, winter sunlight streaming through recently installed windows. Samuel had ridden to town for supplies, leaving her to continue organizing the space that would soon become the heart of their household. She moved methodically, placing crockery on shelves, arranging utensils in drawers, creating order that reflected her vision of their shared future. Through the window, she could see the creek flowing steadily, bordered by bare trees that would leaf out with spring's arrival. Beyond stood Shadow Mesa, its weathered face watching over the valley as it had for countless generations. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her contemplation. Clara moved to the door, expecting to see Samuel returning earlier than anticipated. Instead, she found Sheriff Reeves dismounting in the yard, his expression grave. "Thomas," she greeted him, using his first name as had become their custom in recent months. "Samuel's in town." "I know," Reeves replied, removing his hat. "I came to speak with you, Clara." Something in his tone raised her guard. "What's happened?" Reeves hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with his errand. "Received a wire from El Paso yesterday. Jenkins has been located." Clara's hand rose instinctively to her throat, fingers finding the thimble that remained her talisman. "Where?" Mexico City, Reeves replied. Under a different name, but definitely him. Federal authorities are working with Mexican officials to arrange extradition. Relief and apprehension mingled in Clara's response. That's good news. There's more, Reeves continued reluctantly. Judge Wilson requests your presence in El Paso to give formal testimony. Your written statement was helpful, but for the case to proceed properly, I need to appear in person, Clara finished for him. Reeves nodded, watching her carefully. I told the judge you're recently married, building a new home, asked if your husband's testimony might suffice. And, Clara prompted, Wilson was firm, said your eyewitness account is essential. Reeves replaced his hat. I'm sorry, Clara. I know returning to El Paso isn't what you'd choose. Clara squared her shoulders, determination replacing initial disquiet. When would I need to leave? Next week's stage would get you there in time. Reeves hesitated. Samuel won't like it. A small smile touched Clara's lips. No, but he'll understand. After Reeves departed, Clara returned to her organizing, her movements now infused with new purpose. The prospect of returning to El Paso, facing the place and people she had fled, brought neither the paralyzing fear of months ago nor complete equanimity. Instead, she felt resolute determination to complete what had begun with her flight and would end with her testimony. When Samuel returned mid-afternoon, she met him in the yard, accepting his quick kiss of greeting before helping unload supplies from the wagon. Reeves was here, she said without preamble once they were inside. Samuel paused in removing his coat, instantly alert to her tone. What happened? Clara explained the situation concisely, watching his expression shift from concern to controlled anger to reluctant acceptance. I'll accompany you, he said when she finished, the statement brooking no argument. The house, Clara began. Can wait, Samuel interrupted firmly. You don't face this alone, Clara. The simple declaration warmed her despite the circumstances. I was hoping you'd say that, she admitted, though I would have gone alone if necessary. Pride and concern mingled in Samuel's gaze. I know you would have, that's why I won't let you. That evening, as they prepared for bed in the ranch house that would soon be relegated to secondary status, Clara found herself studying Samuel's profile in the lamplight. The man who had reluctantly opened his door to a desperate stranger had become the center of her world, not through dependency, but through mutual respect that had deepened into something more profound. What are you thinking? Samuel asked, catching her contemplative gaze. Clara moved to sit beside him on the edge of the bed, her hand finding his. That life rarely follows the paths we imagine for ourselves. Samuel's fingers intertwined with hers. Disappointed? No, Clara replied honestly. Surprised. When I fled El Paso, I thought I was running toward nothing, just away from danger. I never expected to find... She hesitated, searching for adequate words. Home, Samuel supplied, understanding in his eyes. Clara nodded, grateful for his perception. Yes, not just a place, but a state of being, of belonging. Samuel brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles. Whatever happens in El Paso, remember that home travels with you now. The simple reassurance steadied her, as did the quiet certainty in his voice. They had both lived solitary lives before circumstances brought them together. He by choice. After violence had marked his early years, she by necessity as she struggled to survive. The connection they had forged transcended romance or convenience, built instead on recognition of shared resilience, of complementary strengths, of the possibility of redemption through honest labor and genuine care. The journey to El Paso unfolded without incident, the stagecoach carrying them across familiar territory that Clara now viewed through transformed perspective. The desert between Aguamiel and the border city no longer represented desperate escape, but rather a path connecting different aspects of her life, past and present, flight and return, fear and resolve. Samuel remained attentive throughout, his presence both protective and respectful of her independence. He understood without explanation that this journey represented necessary closure, a confrontation with ghosts that would allow their future to proceed unburdened by shadows. El Paso greeted them with the bustle and noise Clara had almost forgotten during months in Aguamiel's quiet isolation. They took rooms at a respectable hotel rather than returning to the neighborhood where she had previously lived, a deliberate choice to maintain separation between her former life and present identity. Judge Wilson received them in his chambers the following morning, his shrewd eyes assessing Clara with professional interest. "Mrs. Burke," he acknowledged, using her married name with deliberate emphasis. "Your written testimony was most helpful. Your presence here demonstrates admirable courage." Clara sat straight back beside Samuel, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm prepared to testify to what I witnessed, Your Honor." The judge nodded approval. "The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Jenkins' extradition from Mexico was completed yesterday. He's currently in custody." A tremor passed through Clara at the knowledge that Howard Jenkins was once again in the same city, separated only by prison walls rather than miles of desert. Samuel's hand found hers beneath the table, a gesture hidden from the judge but profoundly grounding. "Will she be protected?" Samuel asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once made men step aside in saloons and on dusty streets. Judge Wilson studied him with new interest. "Mr. Burke, your reputation precedes you." "My past doesn't concern me," Samuel replied evenly. "My wife's safety does." The judge nodded, respect evident in his manner. "Mrs. Burke will be under court protection throughout the proceedings. Jenkins has powerful friends, but they're rapidly distancing themselves as evidence of his criminal enterprises mounts." The remainder of the day passed in careful preparation, reviewing testimony, establishing timelines, ensuring Clara's account aligned precisely with physical evidence and other witnesses' statements. Throughout, Samuel remained at her side, his presence a reminder of the life awaiting their return. That night, in the anonymous comfort of their hotel room, Clara stood at the window looking out over the city where her previous life had ended, and her current one had, in a sense, begun. "Strange to be here again," she mused as Samuel joined her. "Everything looks the same, yet nothing is." "Because you've changed," Samuel observed, his arms slipping around her waist. Clara leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his warmth. "We both have." Samuel nodded, his chin brushing her hair. "For the better, I think." "Yes," Clara agreed, turning within the circle of his arms to face him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for being here, for being the man you are now, not the man you once were." Something in her words touched him deeply. She saw it in the softening of his expression, the momentary vulnerability in eyes usually guarded by habit and experience. "Clara," he said simply, her name containing all he couldn't articulate. She rose on tiptoes to kiss him, pouring into the contact everything words failed to express. Gratitude, reassurance, the profound connection that had transformed them both. His response held equal eloquence, arms tightening around her with protective tenderness that acknowledged her strength rather than diminishing it. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through unfamiliar windows. Clara dressed with deliberate care in her blue dress, now a symbol of courage rather than disguise. Samuel watched her preparations with quiet pride, his presence steadying as they prepared to face the day's challenges. The courthouse loomed imposing against the clear sky, its stone facade representing the justice Clara had once doubted was possible. Samuel walked beside her up the broad steps, his hand at the small of her back offering support without controlling. Inside, the proceedings unfolded with formal precision. Clara took the witness stand, her voice steady as she recounted the events of that April night, the argument overheard, the fatal shot, her desperate flight after being discovered. Throughout her testimony, she kept her eyes on Samuel rather than Jenkins, drawing strength from his unwavering presence rather than allowing intimidation from the man who had pursued her across the territory. When cross-examination came, Jenkins' attorney attempted to undermine her credibility, suggesting alternative interpretations of what she had witnessed. Clara remained composed, answering honestly while maintaining the simple truth of her account. "And why should the court believe your version of events, Mrs. Burke?" the defense attorney asked with calculated skepticism. "A seamstress with no formal education against a respected businessman." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Because truth doesn't require credentials to be true, sir. I saw what I saw. I reported what I saw. The evidence supports my account, not Mr. Jenkins' denials." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. From his place in the audience, Samuel's eyes conveyed pride and certainty that fortified her resolve. By afternoon's end, the judge had ruled that sufficient evidence existed for Jenkins to stand trial for murder and various criminal enterprises. Clara's testimony had provided the final piece necessary to move forward with full proceedings. As they left the courthouse, Samuel's arm protective around her shoulders, Clara felt a weight lifting, not completely gone, but substantially lightened by the day's events. Justice had been set in motion. Her part, while not yet complete, had been honorably fulfilled. "Ready to go home?" Samuel asked as they descended the courthouse steps. Clara looked up at him, sunshine warming her face after hours in the formal courtroom. "Yes," she replied simply. "To our home, to what we're building together." Samuel's smile, rare but transformative when it appeared, brightened his weathered features. "To foundations laid properly," he agreed, "and walls strong enough to weather whatever comes." Together they walked through the streets of El Paso, no longer fugitives from the past, but architects of a future built on truth, resilience, and the quiet power of choosing each other day after day. Ahead lay the journey back to Aguamiel, to Shadow Mesa's protective presence, to the house taking shape in the sheltered valley, physical manifestation of the home they had already created within each other's hearts. Spring arrived at Shadow Mesa with gentle insistence, transforming the landscape with startling rapidity. The valley bloomed first, protected by surrounding hills, nurtured by the creek's steady flow. Wildflowers carpeted slopes in riotous color. Cottonwoods unfurled tender green leaves, and Mrs. Abernathy's rose cuttings, carefully tended through winter months, produced their first tentative buds along the pathway to the new house. Clara and Samuel completed their move in early April, exactly 1 year after her desperate arrival at the ranch house. The timing seemed fitting, a cycle completed, a new one beginning. The old house remained in use for ranch operations and occasional guests, but the valley dwelling became home, filled with the touches Clara had incorporated throughout its construction. Windows positioned to capture morning light, a kitchen organized for efficiency, yet spacious enough for comfort, a study lined with Samuel's books, a porch wrapping around 3 sides to offer shade throughout the day. Every element reflected their combined sensibilities, his practical experience melded with her attention to beauty and detail. The garden Clara had established flourished under her attentive care. Vegetables grew in neat rows, herbs filled a dedicated section near the kitchen door, and flowers, once considered frivolous luxury, now bordered walkways and gathered in colorful clusters near windows. The land responded to her touch as if recognizing kindred resilience, producing abundance that surprised even Miguel, whose family had farmed the region for generations. "The earth knows the hands that tend it," he observed one morning as he helped Clara harvest early lettuce. "It gives more when tended with love." Clara smiled, brushing soil from her fingers. "My grandmother said something similar, that plants respond to intention as much as water." Their life settled into rhythms both familiar and new. Samuel continued managing the ranch with Miguel's assistance, but now returned each evening to a home filled with warmth and purpose. Clara divided her time between household management and the dressmaking business she had established. Small at first, serving only Aguamiel's modest population, but gradually attracting customers from surrounding settlements as her reputation for quality and creativity spread. News arrived from El Paso in late April. Howard Jenkins had been convicted of murder and various criminal enterprises. The judge had sentenced him to hang, final justice for the man whose ambition had claimed multiple lives and threatened Clara's. The letter from Judge Wilson conveyed both the verdict and his personal gratitude for Clara's courage in testifying. Samuel found her on the porch that evening, the letter open in her lap as she watched sunset paint Shadow Mesa in deepening shades of amber and gold. He sat beside her, his presence a quiet comfort as she processed the news. "How do you feel?" he asked after a moment. Clara considered the question carefully. "Relieved," she said finally, "not joyful at a man's death, even his, but relieved that justice was served. That truth prevailed." Samuel nodded understanding. "Closure of a sort." "Yes." Clara folded the letter carefully. Though not an ending. More like permission to continue without looking back quite so often. Samuel's hand found hers, fingers, intertwining with familiar ease. The past shapes us, he observed, but doesn't have to define us. The simple philosophy captured what they had both discovered through their unlikely union, that redemption came not through erasing history, but through building upon it, creating something new from the raw materials of experience. As twilight deepened around them, Clara rested her head against Samuel's shoulder, gratitude flowing through her for this unexpected life, not perfect, not without challenges, but authentic and freely chosen rather than dictated by fear or convention. The roses along the pathway had begun to bloom, their fragrance carrying on the evening breeze. Mrs. Abernathy had been right. With proper care, they would outlive them all, legacy of beauty persisting through seasons of both hardship and joy. I received a letter from Edith today as well, Clara mentioned, as they watched stars emerge above Shadow Mesa. She says travelers have been stopping in Aguamiel, asking about my dressmaking. Apparently word has spread as far as Tucson. Samuel glanced at her, pride evident in his expression. Not surprising. Your work deserves recognition. Clara smiled, still unused to praise despite Samuel's consistent appreciation. She suggested I might consider taking on an apprentice, a girl from Junction Springs with a gift for needlework but limited opportunities. What do you think? Samuel asked, his tone making clear that the decision was entirely hers. Clara had been contemplating the idea since reading Edith's letter. I think, she began slowly, that knowledge is meant to be shared. That skills, passed down through generations, shouldn't end with me. Samuel nodded approval. Your grandmother would be proud. The simple observation touched Clara deeply. Her hand rose to the thimble she still wore around her neck, connection to her past that now represented continuity rather than loss. Yes, she agreed softly. I believe she would. The next morning, Clara wrote to Edith accepting the proposal, offering to meet the girl and determine if an apprenticeship would benefit them both. The act of extending herself, creating opportunity rather than merely accepting it, represented another step in her evolution from frightened fugitive to woman of purpose and belonging. As spring deepened towards summer, life in the valley home established patterns that honored both tradition and innovation. Samuel and Clara hosted Sunday dinners for Miguel's extended family, creating community where isolation had once prevailed. Clara began teaching a sewing circle for local women, sharing techniques learned in El Paso's fashion-conscious society. Samuel, to everyone's surprise, including his own, found himself serving on Aguamiel's newly formed town council, his measured judgment respected, even by those who remembered his earlier reputation. Their days unfolded with purpose, their nights with tenderness. The woman who had once expected nothing beyond survival, and the man who had believed solitude, his permanent condition, discovered together the persistent miracle of growth in their garden, in their work, in themselves, in what they created between them. On a perfect May evening, as they sat on their porch watching twilight gather over Shadow Mesa, Samuel took Clara's hand with unusual solemnity. I have something for you, he said, withdrawing a small package from his pocket. Clara accepted, it curiously unwrapping the simple brown paper to reveal a silver chain supporting a pendant, her mother's thimble, now transformed by delicate silverwork into jewelry that preserved its original form while elevating its beauty. Samuel, she whispered, emotion tightening her throat. How did you— Miguel's youngest brother has been apprenticing with a silversmith in Tucson, Samuel explained. I asked if he could create something that would honor the thimble's significance while making it easier to wear. Clara lifted the pendant, watching light play across the silver filigree that now surrounded her most treasured possession. The transformation seemed appropriate metaphor for her own journey, essence preserved while form evolved, past honored while allowing for present beauty. It's perfect, she said, eyes meeting his with wordless gratitude. Samuel took the necklace from her hands, moving behind her chair to fasten it around her neck. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at her nape. touch conveying tenderness beyond words. "Like you," he murmured, the rare compliment carrying special weight for its sincerity. Clara's hand rose to touch the pendant as Samuel resumed his seat beside her. The thimble rested against her heart, transformed yet unchanged, like the woman who wore it, like the man beside her, like the life they had forged together in this sheltered valley beneath Shadow Mesa's watchful presence. Night descended fully, stars emerging in familiar constellations overhead. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and challenges, its own small joys and necessary labors. But tonight, they sat in peaceful companionship, two people who had found in each other not completion but complementarity, not rescue but partnership in building something neither could have created alone. The desert stretched around them, harsh yet beautiful, unforgiving yet abundant to those who understood its nature. In many ways it resembled the love they had discovered, not easy, not guaranteed, but resilient and life-giving, when tended with patience, respect, and genuine care. Clara's hand found Samuel's in the darkness, the gesture both familiar and ever new. Together they watched over their domain, garden and home, present and future, the legacy they were creating not just in structure and land, but in the intangible architecture of relationship built on truth rather than illusion, strength rather than dominance, mutual growth rather than dependency. Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the star-scattered sky, ancient and enduring. Clara drew comfort from its permanence, from the quiet breathing of the man beside her, from the weight of the transformed thimble against her heart. 3 anchors. In a world of change, 3 reminders that some things persist despite time's passage and circumstances' vagaries. Home, she had discovered, was not merely location, but orientation. Knowing where one belonged and being fully present there, roots, extending deep into chosen ground, boundaries established not to exclude, but to define what merited protection and nurture. As moonlight washed the valley in silver radiance, Clara and Samuel sat in companionable silence, 2 people who had journeyed from isolation to connection, from wariness to trust, from mere survival to genuine flourishing, transformation as miraculous and natural as the desert's spring blooming, as enduring as Shadow Mesa's ancient presence, as precious as the legacy they continued to build with each shared day and night beneath the vast New Mexico sky. The years unfolded with the rhythm of seasons, each bringing its own challenges and blessings, each adding layers to the life Clara and Samuel built together beneath Shadow Mesa's watchful presence. Their valley home evolved from new construction to established homestead, its walls absorbing the echoes of shared meals, meaningful conversations, occasional disagreements, and the steady accumulation of daily moments that comprised their shared existence. 5 years after their wedding, Clara stood in her garden on a brilliant October morning, the air carrying that particular clarity unique to desert autumn. Mrs. Abernathy's roses had flourished beyond expectation, their canes now forming a substantial hedge along the pathway to the house. Clara pruned them with careful attention, each cut deliberate, each decision based on knowledge accumulated through seasons of observation and care. "Mama!" A child's voice interrupted her concentration. "Papa says to tell you Ryder's coming." Clara straightened, shielding her eyes against the sun as she turned toward her daughter. Elena Burke, 4 years old and fiercely independent, stood at the garden gate, dark hair escaping its braids, eyes, so like her father's, bright with excitement. "Did Papa say who?" Clara asked, removing her gardening gloves. Elena shook her, head already turning to race back toward the house. Strangers. Strangers remained rare enough in Aguamiel to merit attention. Clara gathered her tools and followed at a more measured pace, pausing to wash her hands at the outdoor pump before continuing to the house. Samuel stood on the porch, rifle not visible but certainly within reach. Old habits persisted despite years of peace. Eleanor had climbed onto the porch railing, her father's steadying hand at her back as they watched dust rise from approaching horses. 3 riders, Samuel reported as Clara joined them, taking their time. Clara nodded, automatically checking that Elena's position was secure before her own gaze shifted to the approaching visitors. The years had taught her vigilance without fear, preparedness without paranoia, Balanced perspective that acknowledged potential threats without allowing them to dominate. As the riders drew closer, details emerged. 2 men and a woman, their clothing and equipment suggesting travelers rather than drifters, purpose rather than random wandering. "Papa," Elena stage whispered, "the lady rides like you showed me." Samuel's expression softened with pride and amusement. "So she does. Good eye, little one." Clara exchanged a glance with her husband, sharing momentary appreciation for their daughter's observational skills, a trait inherited from both parents and encouraged through gentle guidance. The riders approached the final stretch of road leading to the house, close enough now for Clara to note details. The woman's practical divided riding skirt, the older man's distinguished bearing, the younger man's careful attention to his companions. Not the threatening presence of Howard Jenkins and his hired guns 5 years earlier, but visitors with apparent purpose. "Mr. and Mrs. Burke," the older man called as they reached the yard. "Judge Robert Wilson, El Paso District Court. My apologies for arriving unannounced." Recognition flashed through Clara, not of the man himself, whom she had never met, but of the name. Judge Wilson's predecessor had presided over Jenkins' trial, had sent the formal letter announcing the verdict and sentence. "Judge Wilson," Samuel acknowledged, stepping forward as the visitors dismounted. "What brings you to Shadow Mesa Ranch?" The judge removed his hat, revealing silver hair and an expression of respectful purpose. "A matter concerning Howard Jenkins' estate, actually. This is my daughter, Margaret, and her husband, Dr. Thomas Harrington." Clara moved forward to stand beside Samuel, Elena now balanced on her hip despite the child's growing weight. "Jenkins died in prison 2 years ago," she said. The statement neither question nor accusation, merely fact. "Indeed, Mrs. Burke," the judge confirmed. "His legal affairs have taken considerable time to untangle. His legitimate businesses were liquidated to compensate those he defrauded, but certain assets remained unclaimed." He glanced at his daughter, who withdrew an envelope from her saddlebag. "Perhaps we might discuss this inside?" Samuel suggested, his natural courtesy emerging despite evident wariness. Clara led the visitors into their home, settling them in the front room while she prepared coffee, and Samuel entertained Eleanor in the kitchen, distracting their curious daughter while maintaining proximity should Clara need him. When they were seated with refreshments, Judge Wilson continued his explanation. "Mrs. Burke, your testimony was instrumental in bringing Jenkins to justice. What you may not know is that his organization had victimized many others, particularly women whose financial vulnerability made them targets for various schemes." Clara listened attentively, awareness growing that this visit connected to her, passed in unexpected ways. "My daughter Margaret," Wilson continued with evident pride, "has established a foundation to assist these women, providing training, employment, even seed money for small businesses." Margaret Harrington leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We focus particularly on skills development, helping women achieve financial independence through marketable abilities." Understanding dawned in Clara's mind. "Like dressmaking," she said softly. Margaret nodded. "Exactly. Your own journey, from seamstress to witness to successful businesswoman, represents precisely the kind of transformation we hope to facilitate." Clara's dressmaking enterprise had indeed flourished beyond her modest expectations. What had begun as occasional work for Aguamiel residents had expanded to regular commissions from Tucson, El Paso, even Santa Fe. She now employed 3 full-time assistants, including the girl from Junction Springs, who had arrived as apprentice and remained as valued colleague. "The remaining assets from Jenkins' estate," Judge Wilson explained, "have been designated for this foundation. We're establishing training centers in several territorial cities, and we'd like to offer you a position—" "No," Samuel interrupted. From the doorway, protective instinct evident in his posture, "Clara's place is here." Clara turned toward her husband, understanding his reaction while recognizing the limitations it imposed. "Samuel," she said gently, "let's hear what they're proposing before deciding." The exchange between them, his protectiveness, her gentle assertion, their mutual respect despite differing initial reactions, did not go unnoticed by their visitors. Margaret Harrington smiled slightly, approval in her expression. "Not relocation, Mr. Burke," she clarified. "Rather, we're hoping Mrs. Burke might consider hosting occasional workshops here, sharing her expertise with selected participants who could then return to their communities with valuable skills." Relief softened Samuel's stance. "I see. We would compensate your time generously," Dr. Harrington added, addressing Clara directly, "and provide all necessary materials and transportation for students." Clara considered the proposal, mind already calculating practical considerations, space requirements, scheduling around seasonal ranch work, Elena's needs and routines. How many students? How often? The discussion continued for nearly an hour, details emerging, and questions addressed with respectful thoroughness. Throughout, Clara felt growing certainty that this opportunity represented meaningful extension of what she had already built, not replacement or disruption, but natural evolution. When the visitors departed late afternoon, Clara stood beside Samuel on the porch, watching them disappear toward Aguamiel, where they would spend the night before continuing to Tucson. "You're considering it," Samuel observed, no judgment in his tone. Clara nodded, leaning slightly against his solid presence. "It feels right, using what I've learned to help others find their own path." Samuel's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. "Your grandmother's legacy continuing." The observation, so characteristic of Samuel's perceptiveness, touched Clara deeply. "Yes," she agreed softly, "exactly that." Elena emerged from the house where she had been napping, sleepy-eyed but determined not to miss anything further. Samuel lifted her effortlessly, settling her on his shoulders, where she giggled and grasped his hair for balance. "Careful up there," he cautioned, though his expression held nothing but adoration for the daughter, who had his deliberate nature and Clara's observant eyes. They walked together toward the garden, family unit complete in itself, yet connected to wider circles, the ranch workers who depended on them, the community that had gradually accepted and then embraced them, and now this new opportunity, extending their influence beyond Aguamiel's modest boundaries. As twilight approached, they completed evening chores together, Samuel teaching Elena to scatter feed for chickens, Clara harvesting vegetables for tomorrow's meals, each contributing according to ability and need. The domestic ritual, repeated countless times over the years, retained its significance as affirmation of what they had built together. Later, with Elena asleep and night fully descended, Clara and Samuel sat on their porch as they had so often throughout their marriage. Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the star-scattered sky, its weathered face unchanged despite the transformations that had occurred in its protective presence. "I never imagined this life," Clara mused, her hand finding Samuel's with practiced ease. "When I fled El Paso, survival was my only goal. A place to hide, enough work to eat. Nothing more." Samuel's fingers tightened around hers. "And now?" Clara considered the question, its simplicity belying its depth. "Now I think about legacy, what we leave behind, what Elena will carry forward, what others might build upon what we've created." Samuel nodded, understanding flowing between them, as it had since those early days when communication occurred through coffee kept warm and gardens tended with care. "The judge's proposal," Clara continued, "feels like closing a circle, using what began as tragedy to create opportunity. Redemption," Samuel suggested. "Yes." The word hung between them, applying not just to Jenkins' ill-gotten gains repurposed for good, but to their own journeys, from solitary souls marked by past wounds to partners creating something neither could have managed alone. Shadow Mesa loomed dark against the horizon, ancient witness to countless human dramas played out beneath its impassive face. Clara drew strength from its permanence, from the solid presence of the man beside her, from the knowledge that their daughter slept peacefully within the home they had built together. Home, no longer merely shelter from danger but nucleus of purpose, no longer hiding place but launching point. The woman who had stumbled into Aguamiel seeking anonymity had found instead identity more authentic than any she had previously claimed. The man who had retreated from society seeking solitude had discovered that meaningful connection required not denial of his nature, but its channeling toward protection rather than destruction. Together they had created something neither had imagined possible. Family defined not by blood alone but by choice, by daily recommitment, by the persistent miracle of growth that occurred when care was given and received with equal sincerity. The desert stretched around them, harsh yet beautiful, demanding yet generous to those who respected its nature. Like love, Clara had discovered, it required both resilience and vulnerability, both strength and surrender, both boundaries and openness. Samuel's hand remained steady in hers, anchor and partner, protector and equal. The years had weathered them both, silver threading his dark hair, fine lines marking the corners of her eyes, external signs of internal journeys shared and individual challenges faced. "Whatever you decide about the judge's proposal," Samuel said finally, "I support you." The simple declaration contained volumes, acknowledgement of her autonomy, respect for her judgment, confidence in her ability to balance multiple responsibilities and relationships. "I know," Clara replied, gratitude flowing through her for this man who had evolved from reluctant host to husband to father, without losing the essential qualities that had first earned her trust: his honesty, his principled nature, his capacity for growth without self-betrayal. As midnight approached, they moved inside together, checking first on Elena, sprawled across her bed in abandoned sleep, one arm wrapped around the rag doll Clara had made for her 3rd birthday. Samuel adjusted the blanket while Clara smoothed their daughter's tangled hair, shared tenderness for this miraculous being who represented their future, continuing beyond them. In their own room, preparation for sleep unfolded with comfortable familiarity, Clara loosening her hair from its practical daytime arrangement, Samuel banking the small fire against night's chill, movements choreographed through years of shared space and mutual consideration. Later, as Samuel's breathing deepened toward sleep beside her, Clara remained awake, contemplating the day's unexpected developments. The prospect of sharing her knowledge with women seeking self-sufficiency appealed to something fundamental in her nature. The same impulse that had driven her to preserve her grandmother's herbal wisdom, to tend gardens with attentive care, to create beauty through fabric and thread. Through the window, Shadow Mesa remained visible against the night sky, its presence reassuring in its constancy. Clara thought of the generations who had lived and died beneath its watchful face: indigenous peoples, Spanish settlers, ranchers and outlaws, now her own family, adding their story to the accumulated human narrative of survival and adaptation, conflict and cooperation, isolation and connection. What would Elena's life become, growing up in this landscape with its harsh beauty and demanding nature? What legacy would she inherit from parents who had found each other through unlikely circumstance and forged connection through mutual respect and shared purpose? These questions held no immediate answers, but Clara found comfort in their very existence, evidence of a life substantial enough to contemplate future beyond immediate needs, stable enough to consider impact extending beyond present circumstances. She turned toward Samuel, his profile familiar yet never taken for granted. The man who had opened his door to a desperate stranger had become the center of her world, not through dependency, but through the daily miracle of choosing and being chosen, of seeing and being seen, of protecting and being protected. Clara's hand rose to touch the silver pendant at her throat, her mother's thimble transformed by Samuel's thoughtfulness, symbol of past honored while creating present beauty. The gesture had become unconscious ritual over the years, touchstone connecting her to all that had brought her to this moment: loss and discovery, flight and arrival, ending and beginning. Shadow Mesa watched over their valley home as it had, for countless generations, indifferent to human dramas yet providing context for their unfolding. Clara drew comfort from its ancient presence, from the steady breathing of her husband beside her, from the knowledge that their daughter slept peacefully down the hall. 3 anchors in a world of change, 3 reminders that love, like the desert itself, could be both fragile and enduring. As sleep finally claimed her, Clara's last conscious thought was not of past dangers overcome, but of future possibilities awaiting, workshops to plan, skills to share, her daughter's growth to nurture, her marriage to tend with continued care. The woman who had once expected nothing beyond survival now contemplated legacy with quiet confidence, certain that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them not alone, but accompanied, not in fear, but in strength born of genuine connection. Outside their window, Shadow Mesa stood silhouetted against the star-scattered sky, silent witness to the persistent miracle of human resilience, the capacity to begin again, to transform tragedy into opportunity, to create meaning from circumstance, to build home where only shelter had been sought. The desert night enfolded their valley dwelling, peaceful in its temporary stillness yet alive with potential for tomorrow's renewal. Within its walls, 3 hearts beat in separate rhythms yet profound connection. Family forged not merely through blood but through choice, through daily recommitment, through the quiet heroism of loving well despite life's inherent uncertainty. Clara Burke, once Marisol Vega, once desperate fugitive, now wife and mother and artisan and mentor, slept beneath Shadow Mesa's protective presence, at peace with her past, engaged with her present, open to her future, home in the deepest sense of the word.